Dr. Brian Keating flew in this morning just to give this talk. His family is building in Teton Village right now, which is his desire to get closer to the community. He has written a book called Losing the Nobel Prize, and it was one of the more interesting technological academic approaches that I've ever heard. I've known him for a number of years, and I was just so grateful that he was willing to come in. And people here know Brad Mead, and who has his own observatory in his home in Jackson, and Brian has his own observatory in his home in San Diego. There, I said it again, Tandy. So Brian, thank you very much, and we're looking forward to Brian and his family becoming very integrated into the Valley and into the community.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lee, Brittany, Spencer, especially Governor Mead for being here. This is my 11th year coming to Jackson Hole, so I am not a novice in this valley. And thankfully, I've never had to avail myself of any of the medical services available here, okay? When I go down the ski mountains, I'm not that bad a skier, and I hope never to, but nevertheless, we very much enjoy being here. And today, I'm not going to talk about health, although it might be a little bit more morbid than anything that you may have heard to date, because what I'm going to talk about is something sort of allied with these prizes that are given out, and especially the X Prize that Lee is so deeply involved with. And it really dates back to the most prestigious accolade on earth, which is the Nobel Prize. And we're in Nobel Prize season, and just the next week and a half, the winners of the 2018 Nobel Prizes will be announced. And the Nobel Prizes sort of form a key theme, maybe a villain sort of foe, if you will, in my book, Losing the Nobel Prize, which we have free copies for all the attendees, I believe, outside. That the Nobel Prize has the capability to incentivize very great things, but it also has some powerful flaws in it that I think I was able to identify during not one, but two encounters with the Nobel Prize, almost winning it and subsequently losing it, spoiler alert, but also being asked to nominate the winners of the Nobel Prize. So that would be, kind of like the governor almost gets elected, and then the populace says, can you really please tell us somebody better qualified to be governor than yourself? And that's sort of what happened to me, as I'll explain. Here's the prize, the actual invention, which was high technology in the 1860s, actually enabled us to build even some of the connecting infrastructure to Jackson Hole. And that was dynamite, which was a key invention predominantly made for the act of war, making war. So the opposite of why you guys are here, helping people live longer and better lives. But for a long time, Nobel and his family were concerned with killing people. In fact, so much so was the Nobel name associated with death, that in 1888, Alfred Nobel was walking around his beloved streets of Paris, where he had become a voluntary refugee from Sweden, where he grew up. And he saw a headline that said, "Alfred Nobel, the merchant of death, is dead." And it called Alfred the person in history who had killed more people faster, more efficiently, and more quickly than any other person on earth. Now, he's reading this obituary, right? So, as with Mark Twain, the reports of his demise were slightly exaggerated. But in this case, it was actually his older brother Ludwig, who had passed away. And yet it gave Alfred an opportunity to do something very important, to do what I consider posthumous public relations. And it really is, as I mentioned, is sort of a macabre theme, as in contradistinction to the wonderful talks you've heard, the connection being technology used to kill people, and also the morbidity factor that people don't really consider until perhaps it's too late. So this event, when Alfred read his brother's obituary misattributed to him, it caused him to reevaluate his life. And much as George Bailey and It's a Wonderful Life, fantastic movie, or Ebenezer Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, these characters, like Alfred Nobel, reevaluated their lives, and they chose to rehabilitate their name by dedicating it to service of the public. Unfortunately, since those 120 years since Alfred Nobel died, the Nobel Prize has strayed greatly from these lofty visions. And I'll talk about the kind of uncanny lessons that I take away from it. And I've been looking in, because of my relationship with Lee, and he's such a calm Buddhist type, that I thought I would actually connect this to a set of principles from Buddhism that I recently learned about, AKA on the flight over here. And that is that in Buddhism, there are four noble truths. So there's the Trinity in Christianity, there are similar things in Judaism, and Buddhism has the Four Noble Truths. And I think a lot of them apply to scientists and engineers like myself who wish to invent things, create things, and we suffer from some of the pitfalls and perils that the Buddha himself is alleged to have alerted us to. So the first one, very uplifting one, is that all life is misery. Okay, that's really great. I tell that to my 5 kids every day, but they don't get what they want. And I say, well, all life is misery. Sorry, son. The second truth is that the suffering that we have is caused by cravings. That we might want more money, we might want more time, we might want better health, and these are all considered cravings. And I think it's interesting that the sort of path to enlightenment, which is sort of the goal of Buddhism, which is number 4, can be reached in a way that the Buddha called the Eightfold Way. I actually think that's a form of craving, right? These Buddhists they crave enlightenment. Now, the question is whether or not that craving leads to step 3, or the third truth, that you can overcome these cravings by introspection and contemplation. I, of course, am playing on the Nobel versus Noble Truths monikers, but I want to take you back to the first astrophysicist in history who sketched something which last year made quite a show over this fine city, and that was, of course, the moon, which brought a tremendous amount of actually astrotourism. I'm sure the governor can tell me how much money was brought into Jackson Hole. It was not only done for lay people, it was actually for professional astronomers like myself. I received a list when I told them I was going to meet with the governor today. I received a list of all the observatories, all the scientific findings that resulted from this eclipse. And that's pretty amazing when you think an astronomical event can cause tens of thousands of people to converge, spend money, and do good things here. So I'm going to work on trying to get an eclipse in the next couple of years back here so that you guys can, leverage the resources that you invested. But here's Galileo, the first astronomer in history. He didn't invent the telescope, but he perfected it. And he used this device and treated it as a monopoly to make discoveries that no human being had ever seen before. Picture on the lower right, I actually took myself from his famous book called the Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger. And that book is in the hands of a friend of mine at Williams College in Western Massachusetts, and I spoke there last week, and he let me take it out and touch it, and it was too big to fit in my laptop bag. Otherwise, we'd have it here today. But these simple observations of the planet Jupiter and its moons on the upper left here, this illustrated that we lived in a completely new paradigm that no one had ever been aware of before. That the universe in which we inhabited was not centered on us after all. As much as we of scientific variety have great egos, we do not inhabit what is truly the center of the solar system. Nor do we inhabit the center of the galaxy, nor do we inhabit the center of the universe. And now the question is, do we inhabit the center of what has become to be called the multiverse? So we all know there are many planets, many stars, many galaxies. What if there are many universes? And a core theme in my book is how can we unravel whether or not this is true? Whether or not we're not only alone, perhaps, in the entire solar system in terms of life, but whether or not we're accompanied throughout all of space-time by other universes teeming with life or perhaps sterile and barren. And those two possibilities, I think, are just the most fascinating things that you can contemplate. And we're actually attacking that with technology and resources and personnel that we have in San Diego and elsewhere around the world, literally on all 7 continents, including Antarctica, which I'll show you a picture of. The vision that Galileo ushered in was that the Earth only appears to be the center of a vast network of what I call cosmic spheres, spheres that are apparitions that seem to suggest that we are the center of the Earth, that we are the center of the solar system. I mean, it sure does appear that the Earth is flat. It sure does appear that the sun rotates around the Earth. It sure does appear that we're at the center of the galaxy. But all of these are fallacies. All of these reflect biases in humanity's perception of its own self-importance. And a lot of that has to do with the ego, which is part of what Buddhism, as I understand it from my 20 minutes studying it, has to do with overcoming to get to this period of life called enlightenment, which I guess you just sit cross-legged and meditate all the time. Now we know that the universe actually extends far beyond the things that Galileo could see. It extends back to the first 500,000 years after what's called the Big Bang. Now, we don't know now whether or not the Big Bang is the creation of time itself or was merely the creation of the part of the universe that we can observe today. Nevertheless, it's the oldest point in time that we can see back to. and we use technology that I'll explain very briefly. I'm not going to get into great details of it, but it's really just an upgrade to what Galileo Galilei invented in 1609 or used in 1609 to disabuse us of our notion of centrality and importance in the universe. I call Galileo the ultimate big brother, okay? So he's kind of the guy who says, you're not that important, you're not that great, you're not so special. And that's really what he did. He ushered in the notion that we're not the center of anything other than our own particular parochial sphere that we call Earth. So what he hoped would happen was this book would make him world famous, that he would be renowned around the world after showing it to an early version of the governors of northern Italy. This is in Venice, outside Venice. You can see the canals and so forth in the back here. He recognized that a lot of basic technology that we do in physics leads to applications. In military applications, medical applications, the very first Nobel Prize won in physics was awarded to the inventor of the X-ray, which went from an invention in a laboratory not unlike mine in San Diego, this one was in Austria, and it was then used in physicians' offices around the world within weeks. And of course, it benefited mankind in a tremendous way. So Alfred Nobel was wildly successful. He created this prize to rehabilitate a name that had caused death and destruction and become synonymous with those two torturous aspects of humanity. And he made it into something that saved lives around the world. I think it's quite fascinating. And of course, there are Nobel Prizes for medicine as well. So perhaps some of us in the audience will aspire to such things. Anyway, he became wildly famous. And for a professor like me, I have great envy for him because he immediately got tenure at the University of Padua. And not only that, the chair of his department doubled his startup funding. So anyone who's a professor here in the audience will recognize the importance of those two things. So this is what he hoped would just keep on happening. He'd get a lot of cash for it, and he had a lot of mistresses and illegitimate children to support. So this was no small detail for the maestro, as he was known. But instead of having this kind of a reaction to his books, he actually suffered a lot worse. He was actually put on trial famously and forced to abjure and declaim and say that his findings on the Copernican model, on the sun-centered model of the universe, were accursed and basically acts of the devil. And although he is claimed to have said under his breath that, I'm still right, as they were about to put him into prison, the Pope Urban, who's depicted here, very friendly-looking guy here, and this is at the Inquisition, the so-called Holy See. Galileo was forced to recant it and subjected to house imprisonment for the last 9 years of his life. But they couldn't contain his mind. Even though his body was imprisoned, he continued to do research and actually came up with primitive ways to tell time, which sounds primitive. But back then, there were no such thing as watches, smartwatches, health watches, Fitbits, and so forth. They didn't even have a reliable clock. And he came up with ways to do that using the celestial spheres, using maps of Jupiter and its moons. Fascinating that you could use things in space that had practical benefits on Earth. And we like to think that we're trying to extend Galileo's mission not just beyond the spheres of our celestial heavens here, but all the way back to the beginning of time, perhaps, in a way that might illustrate whether or not we are truly alone, not only amongst life forms, but what if we're just one universe out of an infinity of possible universes? And this relates to something called the cosmic microwave background radiation. The light that I study, you cannot see with your eyes, and nor can your iPhone detect it. Instead, what the image that our telescopes capture are fluctuations in the amount of matter and energy present at the universe's first light. Right after the first 500,000 years, which sounds like a long time, but we believe the universe is 13.82 billion years old, give or take 5 or 10 years. And that amount of time elapsed, the properties that we see today were encoded, encrypted, in exactly the same way that your features in some way were encrypted by the smallest features that you had. As I often say, we're trying to divine an image of what the early universe was like a trillionth of a trillionth of a trillionth of a second after the Big Bang. And doing that is far harder. It's actually a billion times harder than trying to do this, which is take an image, which you doctor eggheads will notice, is a blastocyst or a human embryonic stem cell collection. This is an embryo that represents the way you looked about 1,000 seconds, as I always say, after your parents had their own personal Big Bang. That 1,000-second period after the creation or conception event, you were a collection of about 200 stem cells. Now, what would you expect this stem cell embryo would evolve into? Well, I don't expect you to guess just by seeing it, but I'll add some identifying features. And then you may recognize it as none other than my children's favorite astrophysicist, Neil deGrasse Tyson. So we're trying to figure out, if you were trying to figure out what did Neil look like when he was an embryo 1,000 seconds after conception, knowing that he's about 2 billion seconds old, you want to feel old, quote your age in seconds and quote it in billions of seconds, you'll sound really old. So those of you on the verge of your 21st birthday are about 800 million seconds old or so. So try that as a fun exercise. But we're trying to go way back in time. The way that we do that is we built a telescope. And the goal of the telescope was not only to see the Big Bang, but to be honest with you, one of my motivations in creating it was to win these prizes here. I craved these prizes. So Buddha would say, strike two, and nothing good is going to come of it, because this is the most tangible reward, I would say, in all of humanity. I would say that across the planet, there's no greater distinction, honor, accolade, or prize, sorry, Lee, in the X Prize, than winning the Nobel Prize. In fact, some people have won prizes worth far more money, called the Breakthrough Prize, have said things like, I'll trade it in for a Nobel Prize, even though it's worth $3 million more than the Nobel Prize. So why is that? What does it become that makes it so prestigious? Well, we had our eyes trained on this prize. We invented a telescope that's very much like Galileo's telescope. In other words, it just used lenses. And instead of connecting it to his eye, it connected to a set of sensors made of what are called transition edge sensors, superconducting bolometers, which is really just a fancy way of saying heat detectors. So just as you can detect where the sun is with your eyes closed and waving your hand around, these detectors can detect those patterns of microwaves to which our eyes are blind. So we invented these detectors, and there's only 256 of them, which sounds puny compared to your iPhone, which has millions of them. But unlike your iPhone, we don't void our warranty when we cool it down to 454 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Okay, so that's almost 500 degrees colder than this room is right now. And if you could turn it down and make me feel really comfortable, that would be great. No, I'm just kidding, I'm fine. This detector system we had to take somewhere very special. I'd love to take it here and put it on Grand Targhee, but the governor wouldn't approve of it. Instead, we took this whole telescope, which is about 10 feet tall, weighs about 15,000 pounds. We disassembled it, put it inside of cargo planes, and took it to the very bottom of the world, a forbidding place called the South Pole, Antarctica. There it is. And technology is really the key to Antarctica, and it was really the site of the world's first arms race or space race or technology race 105 years ago, when two teams of explorers, one led by Roald Amundsen, who's a Norwegian explorer, and another led by a British explorer named Robert Falcon Scott, coolest middle name ever. Tried to convince my wife to name our most recent son Falcon, but she demurred. Anyway, they had two different approaches technologically, wouldn't you say? So the Norwegian team made use of a very ancient technology, but well-proven and well-understood, called dogs. Instead, the Brits, who knew that they would have to do what the Norwegians would do, which is eat the dogs, when they got to the South Pole, they refused to do that. They said, we're Brits, after all. We have stiff upper lips, but they're not that stiff. They refused to eat the dogs. They said, we'll be the beasts of burden. That cost them all their lives. All these guys died getting to the South Pole just a mere 3 weeks after the Norwegian team made first landfall there. And this is no small feat. Imagine going from sea level to the top of Targhee or something like that, 10,000 feet over a course of 700 nautical miles. On foot or on skis. And it's not groomed powder like we have on some runs here. It's frozen waves of snow predominantly. When Falcon and his team got there, they saw a Norwegian flag. What must that have felt like? Well, I liken it to Neil Armstrong stepping out of the Eagle onto a Soviet flag, a Russian flag. Imagine the sense of disappointment, national prestige, human lives at stake and lost because of this technology shortfall, this lack of vision and foresight. So that cost them their lives, and it's very dangerous to go to the Antarctic today, as I will depict here. This is from my last voyage down there. So my 5-year-old son, he wanted me to bring him back a penguin. I said, of course, it could be easier than capturing a penguin. They can't even fly. And this one's on land, so I figured I'd go up to him. One of my students filmed me. Okay, so beware of penguins. They are not the cuddly creatures that you have come to expect. Instead of getting there by foot, we now take U.S. military cargo planes, which fly us from the southern island of New Zealand, in a town called Christchurch, and fly us all the way down to the South Pole, more or less, over a period of time that takes about 11 hours just to get to the coast of Antarctica, And that 11-hour flight's very comfortable, as you can see here. This is like American Airlines flight getting over here. The passengers sit knee to knee, and you're only afforded one sack of lunch, and it can have any number of different animals that were used to make that lunch. You don't want to ask. Fewer questions, the better. You notice there's almost no windows here. There are almost no windows for passengers on this side over here, because it's almost nothing to see except blinding white ice. By the way, this is the President's Club over here. This is the Admiral's Club. This is first class, business class, lift. When you land at the South Pole, you see this fabulous passenger terminal called the South Pole International Passenger Terminal, where the services are rather incomplete and the Wi-Fi is spotty, to say the least. Now you're about -30 Fahrenheit or so once you get out here. It's quite cold. Here are the waves of snow that these guys had to climb over to get to the South Pole and kind of shown to scale. So it's not like a groomed cross-country powder that you might enjoy here. Here's me taking a selfie, put it on Facebook when I got there the first time I went there. I've been there twice. And we went there to build this telescope called BICEP 2. BICEP 2 has features that allow it to see back to the very beginning of time, and so we thought we'd be quite successful. Perhaps even garnering the most prestigious award known to man, as I said, the Nobel Prize. In fact, we did it. We announced that we made a discovery for technical reasons. I describe it very in good detail in the book. We found a signal, and we found the signal, the exact signal we were looking for. And that's kind of scary in some sense. When you find what you're looking for, it can mean one of two things. You're right, and you're going to celebrate, or you were serving to confirm your biases, and you found something which was just a mirage. So which one was it? Well, the media took a great interest in our discovery because it spoke to the most ancient of human questions, which is how do we get here? How did the universe come to be? And you can see headlines that were really broadcast around the world. This is from Harvard. We had a video that we released, one of the team members at Stanford released, that got 3 million views almost in a day. This is big for science. This is not a Kardashian, new fragrance. This is, kind of nerdy technical scientist doing something that requires a lot of explanation. In fact, it was on the front page of the newspaper of record, the one that prints all news fit to print. Yes, the San Diego Union Tribune. I welcome you all. It's probably in the newspaper here. It was on the front page of the New York Times. I just had breakfast last week with the author, Dennis Overby. I like this headline in The Economist. Just like some guy suddenly saw the start of the universe. Yeah, that's awesome. At least that's the implication. And of course, the greatest scientific journal of record is none other than The Onion, who actually did a good job on their story. They said theoretical physicists and R&B singers met to debate the meaning of forever. And it says down here, there's Aretha Franklin, the late great Aretha Franklin, physicist, Smokey Robinson. It says, panelists discuss whether it is theoretically possible to give you my heart forever. So we didn't answer that question. And unfortunately, as you might guess from the title of my book, it was not to be. The discovery that we thought we had made, one for the ages, that garnered so much fame, fortune, and presumably an itch to the craving that I had had for decades, was not to be. In fact, instead of seeing the birth pangs of the Big Bang, we saw nothing but tiny grains of dust suspended amidst the stars in the Milky Way's magnetic fields. A different type of science, an interesting form of science, but not what we expected to see. And soon after, we had to retract our discovery. Instead of seeing the universe through these pristine lenses and vision all the way back to the beginning of time, no, now we know the universe is basically a pretty polluted place. But it's not all bad news, because without that pollution is actually the stuff that makes up the Earth. It's the same carbon, nitrogen, it's the same iron, nickel, and silicon that makes up the mountains that we're sitting on. So without it, we wouldn't be here, but it does get in the way of Nobel Prizes. So that craving went away, and then I was overcome with a sense of embarrassment to add to my humiliation, which is that the next day, basically, after getting this, the retraction, issuing this retraction, more or less, I received a letter from the Swedish Academy of Sciences inviting me to make a nomination for the Nobel Prize in Physics for the very year I had hoped I might win it. So again, this is like, if you're a realtor, someone doesn't want to use your services, asks you to recommend a better realtor, and that's what I had the honor of doing. And it set me out on a quest, as kind of a nerdy academician, scholar. I went off and did an investigation as to what Alfred Nobel really wanted. Why did he make this prize? What was it for? And that set me off on a path of discovery, which led to the second notion of the title of my book, which is Losing the Nobel Prize. And that is whether or not the Nobel Prize itself needs to be gotten rid of, at least in its current form. Oh, by the way, I'm asking you all to keep this strictly confidential. Okay, don't tell anybody. So they asked me to do that, but I put it in my book. Anyway, I went back to Alfred Nobel's original will, and speaking fluent Swedish, as I know we all do, we can read it. It says here, I, Alfred Nobel, want my entire estate to be annually distributed in the form of prizes to those who have made the greatest benefit to mankind. Now, this is a person who invented dynamite, 354 other patents. He was a known inventor, and he wanted to cause inventions to make things better on Earth. The question is that doing that? Is it actually conferring benefit on mankind? So I go through not 8 ways to enlightenment. I go through 5 different pathways in my book, and I'm almost out of time, and I want to leave time for thunderous applause, so I'll stop soon. But the prize really, this encounter with it, actually, I don't know why this is cut off, but it's probably a PowerPoint conversion issue. It says here, this is Mahatma Gandhi, by the way. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize the same exact number of times as Adolf Hitler. So isn't that wonderful? So one of the greatest humanitarians on earth, unfortunately never won it. Thank God Adolf Hitler never won it either. But he said, before he lost his own Nobel Prize, he said, the seeker after truth must be humbler than the dust. Because although the world crushes dust under its feet, we should think that dust could crush us. And what a perfect metaphor for what we did and what we saw. We thought we were seeing this thing that would bring us worldwide acclaim that we craved. Instead, it humbled us. But it put us on a pathway to invent new and better technology. And I'll just close with a statement revolving around this will, which is that, so we just had Yom Kippur for those of us who are Jewish yesterday, and one of the sayings caught my eye in the prayer book services. And it said, repent one day before your death. And so, of course, you don't know when you're going to die. So you should repent. You should have this sense of humility and leave an ethical will behind for yourself. A will, Jesus did it, Moses did it, and Barack Obama did it, and many of the great leaders and thinkers in history have done it. And it's one of the most greatest gifts you can give to your children and their grandchildren. After all, think about it. What if you have kids or grandkids? And what if you know that somewhere way back in history, your beloved great-grandfather wrote a book? And in that book were described his secrets, or your grandmother, her secrets, and words of wisdom for life. How much would you pay for that book? Well, you'll be able to get mine for free outside, but think about leaving a legacy. And that's part of what I think we should all do and pay heed to. So I'll leave you with that. Happy to take questions. I guess we might be a couple minutes over time, but thank you very much for having me out here. Guys are worse than my students, okay? It's the high altitude. Oh, yes, over there. I nominated someone who's, my oldest son would say, the name is Nunya Business. So I don't tell in the book because the person or persons may or may not still be alive. And according to the rules of the Nobel Foundation, they could still be nominated. So even though I have misgivings about it, I didn't want to scuttle his or her chances. But you might be able to divine from the description in the book who I might have nominated, because I do give some hints to it. Yeah, right here.
So what you did, issuing that retraction, is the highest ethical standard which scientists apply to themselves, right?
Absolutely, yes.
We're living in a world now where science and technology are coming ever closer together, and you've got some of the best science on Earth being done by for-profit corporations instead of by academics. We've all seen what just happened when John Kerry tore the lid off Theranos. Right? Is there a place for the scientific method in what we do as technologists? Are there changes that need to be made? Is there a reason why it's being sidestepped?
Absolutely, yeah. So the question is whether or not the ethical kind of best practices within science, assuming that they're not compromised themselves, as a questioner alluded to, if those can be applied to society at large. So scientific method, in my opinion, is the greatest invention that's ever been made. Greater than the telescope, greater than the lighthouse, which won the Nobel Prize in 1911. These are inventions that allow us to save time, to ensure quality, and to ensure that the best and greatest minds and representation from all around the world and different corners of the world are represented. So we don't want to miss out on the next Einstein. But a lot of what's happening in science right now is really not fully encompassing the panorama that science truly is. Some of that, in my opinion, is caused by the Nobel Prize and this fixation that only 3 people can win it. My experiment had 50 people. The current experiment I'm leading has 255, and the experiment that won it last year had 1,000 people on it. Now, how do you pick 3 people at most, which Alfred Nobel, didn't even approve of? How do you do that and not leave out broad swaths of humanity? So there are ways in the book I describe how we can apply the tools of the scientific method to ensure ethical best practices are met. Yeah, in the back. In 20 years, where do I see the field? So, one of the funders of my experiment is a billionaire in New York City named Jim Simons, and he asked me a question: when are you going to make your discovery? And I said, maybe in 20 years we'll rewrite the history book and your name will be. He's like, make it 5, okay? So the hardest thing to do is to make predictions about what will happen in the future, as Yogi Berra said, right? They're particularly difficult. But in my mind, what we are going to do is equally equivalent, and not just me, these are much smarter people than me, my students and coworkers, that we can make a revolution perhaps that tells us how the universe came to be. And what, if anything, have you ever thought, what came before the Big Bang? Have you ever thought, are there other universes out there besides ours? So art groups are trying to blend the technology, the brain power, the computational horsepower that we have to take steps to understand what happened 15 minutes before the Big Bang. I most want to answer that question. I believe we'll have some inkling of the answer to that question within 20 years. There's a question up there. Right here, yeah.
If Nobel was doing this thing starting today, would he be impressed by the way it's working today, or would he be pissed off at
Yeah, so the question is, if Nobel were alive today, would he be upset at what's become of the prize? Well, I'll say 2 things. One is that he made it very clear what he wants in his will, and I described that in the book. So by the way, the book is mostly about a memoir of cosmology. There are 3 chapters about the Nobel Prize. Those are color-coded, so you can skip them if you don't care. But if you do care, I talk about how an estate lawyer would prosecute the executors of the Nobel Prize, because what they've done is completely transgress what he wanted, which was that a prize should be given to a single person who made an invention or discovery in the preceding year that caused the greatest benefit to humankind. Now, I go through those different 3 things. I call those broken lenses of the Nobel Prize. And what he would most be shocked about is that we're giving awards for things that were done decades ago to groups of 3 people, not 1 person. And some of the awards that we're giving, it's questionable. 5 years ago, the Nobel Prize went for the discovery of the Higgs boson. You may or may not know that. In fact, you probably don't know that, which shows how much of a benefit did it cause to humankind. In fact, I would worry for you if you told me the Higgs boson's really important to my daily life. Even a physicist doesn't care about it that much. But the number one thing I think he would be rolling over in his grave, quite literally, and he was worried about being buried alive, and he took great steps to make sure he was dead. Is that so in my religion, Judaism, if you, the highest mitzvah, the highest good deed you can do is take care of someone who's dead. Because you're doing it completely selflessly. They can't do anything to repay you for taking care of their dead body, right? So in this case, the contravailing worst sin you can do is go against what a person wanted explicitly, because there's nothing they can do. And so we should uphold what Alfred Nobel wanted. So I think he'd be spinning his ashes would be spinning. He got cremated and he also got his blood out. So he was an interesting guy. So I think he'd be appalled in some sense. Yeah, I know.
Where has your research brought you as far as a position on Fermi's paradox?
Fermi's paradox, fascinating. So Fermi's paradox suggests that there are literally trillions of planets, perhaps in our own galaxy. There are probably 500 billion galaxies that we can eventually see in our observable universe, each one with 1 trillion planets within it. The question that Enrico Fermi, winner of the 1943 Nobel Prize in Physics, he conjectured if there's so many planets, then even if only 1 in 1 trillion have planets, there's trillions and trillions of planets in the known universe. There should be trillions of other life forms. They should have been here by now. And yet we have 0 credible evidence for it, despite the close encounters that took place not far from here, right? Come on, you guys should get that, right? Close encounters, come on. Nevertheless, we have 0 evidence for the existence of other life. And in fact, depressingly, I just finished a book by a co-author at my publisher, Norton, named Adam Frank, where he says that we have to stop really looking for actual technology with ET, beaming us messages, or getting close encounters in some other way. But instead, we have to look for the byproducts of a civilization. So look for global warming on planet Blorcon in the Andromeda Galaxy. So it's gotten so depressing for these people. I feel sorry for them. They haven't seen any evidence of it, and they've only, to be fair, basically skimmed one capful of water out of the Pacific Ocean in terms of how much could be explored in the universe, in just our observable universe. So I think it's currently very depressing, the status of Fermi's paradox. It sure doesn't appear, and the conditions don't seem to be right, but the numbers are overwhelming. There's one more, two. Yep, right there. I would like to go back. I would like to go back to Antarctica. What surprised me so much about it was the desolation and the otherworldliness of being on this frozen outpost, literally at the bottom of the world. And the other thing that surprised me, I'm a terrible runner, I'm pretty out of shape, but I literally ran around the world in under a minute, so that was pretty cool. The other thing that was otherworldly about it is that the sun never sets at the South Pole. It sets, once a year it sets. So it's actually coming up tomorrow at the South Pole. My friend who runs our observatory, he's been there for a year. I tricked him into going down there. I said, I'll give you $75,000 for one night of work. And he bought it. So he's been there, and they don't know where the sun is going to come up. It's amazing. We know the sun's going to come up in the east. Where's the east at the South Pole? It's not defined. We don't know it. It's like, what happened before time existed? Does that make sense? So there are all sorts of just otherworldly phenomena I witnessed there. It was really a blessing to go down there. Is there one more question? No. Okay, last question. Any burning questions? Okay, so there are copies of the book outside, I believe. Yeah, thank you guys very much for having me.